All right, so welcome back. Once again, talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the plan was you usually do not attack a country until you've broken off diplomatic relations. The plan was that the Japanese ambassador was going to deliver the ultimatum notification, basically saying we're breaking off diplomatic relations, to the State Department at 1 p.m. Washington time, which was 7 p.m. Hawaii time, which was 30 minutes before the attack was supposed to begin. Some strange twist of fate in this history was that one of their Japanese compatriots was actually leaving the United States to go back home. So they had a little bit of a party and got a little bit too drunk and actually didn't translate. The person who was supposed to translate it was a little too inebriated, so someone who could translate but didn't know how to work a typewriter was translating it. So as the bombs were dropping in Hawaii, they were still trying to translate it. By the time that the Japanese ambassadors met Hull, it had been 90 minutes since the first bombs were dropped at Pearl Harbor. So basically, the Pacific Fleet was in shambles, and the United States saw this as a surprise attack, and war was going to be declared shortly after. So the attack on Pearl Harbor sank 5 of the 8 battleships. 3 were lightly damaged. 19 out of 96 vessels at Pearl Harbor were seriously damaged or sunk. The naval air stations and marine air stations at Ford Island, Kaneohe, and Ewa were lost 87 planes, 31 were damaged. The Army Air Force lost a total of 74 planes at Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows Field, and 128 were sustained damage. 2,389 Americans were killed, missing, or died from their wounds. Another 1,178 were wounded but recovered. So there were actually 2 waves that attacked Pearl Harbor. There was supposed to be a third wave, but the admiral that was in charge of the task force feared that the United States was getting its forces ready and that they would sustain losses, because they did, in the second wave, did sustain more losses than they had on the first wave's attack. So he canceled the third wave. The targets for the first wave was the fleet. The second wave were the airplanes and the airfields. The third wave would have been the oil tank farms, where basically all of the fuel for these ships were, and also the dry docks where these ships would be repaired. That third wave would never attack, so all of the oil fields stayed in place, as did the dry docks. So looking at the ships, the battleship sunk at Pearl Harbor. USS Arizona was sunk and lost. USS Utah sunk and lost. Nevada was sunk, salvaged, and rejoined the fleet in 1942. Oklahoma was sunk, refloated, but considered too damaged for repair, and was decommissioned in 1944. West Virginia was sunk, refloated, and rejoined the Pacific Fleet in 1944, and it was at the surrender of the Japanese on September 2nd, 1945. The California was sunk, refloated, rebuilt, and rejoined the Pacific Fleet, as did the Pennsylvania, the Maryland, and the Tennessee. So all of these great ships that the Japanese thought they had sunk, well, they did sink, but many of them got repaired and were able to take part in the Second World War and the defeat of Japan. So as the war starts in 1939, the United States is neutral during this, but they are helping out their allies, basically the British. So we haven't really declared war on the Germans, the Japanese, or the Italians, but we were still helping out the war effort, kind of like we did in World War I. So we have the Burke-Wadsworth Conscription Act, where all men aged 25 to 35 registered for at least a year of service. We have the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which basically sent a lot of old destroyers and weapons to the British to help hold off the attack of Germany. Basically, the Lend-Lease Act was that the British would eventually pay for this, but we really knew that they wouldn't. And one of the deals, or the deal that was cut, was after the war, the way they could repay that was we didn't really want the ships back, but we did want all of their naval bases across the world. So if you ever look at a picture of Navy bases across the world now these days, you can see that we have a lot of naval bases around the world. That is because that's how the British paid us back for us lending them destroyers to help keep convoys going. Also, it was declared that there was a neutral zone in the Atlantic that extended from the United States to Iceland to protect the British shipping from German U-boats. The U-boats were back in this war and did some major damage on Allied shipping. So in August of 1941, the British and the Americans signed the Atlantic Charter. It was done in secret aboard the USS Augusta in August of 41. And basically, they did this off the coast of Newfoundland. Both men basically had common goals for the world, and part of it was self-rule of all peoples, international economic cooperation, the disarmament, and a collective international security, so the beginnings of the UN and freedom of the seas, and also the Atlantic Charter called for what would be the final destruction of Nazi Germany. So following the attack on Pearl Harbor and Oahu on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese also were attacking holdings in Asia and the Pacific, British holdings. So on December 10th, the Japanese sink the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse. Also on the 10th, the Japanese capture Guam, Macon, and Tarawa, and they land troops in the Philippines. On the 12th, or on the 11th of December, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States, and on Christmas Day, Hong Kong, a British colony at that time, surrenders to Japan. Roosevelt addresses Congress on Monday, December 8th, and asks for a declaration of war. So, did Roosevelt know about the attacks? That's a question that still lingers today. Do you think he really would have sacrificed all those sailors and soldiers just to get the United States into the war that was going to eventually touch our shores somehow? So the problem wasn't that the United States knew that the attack was coming, it's that the United States failed to do anything to see that the attack was coming. So basically carrier-based planes attacking ships, there was something they didn't think could actually be successful, but it was proven by a American general named Billy Mitchell, who proved that a plane could sink a ship all the way back in 1921. You can see in that picture there, he sank German warships, and it sank in about 21 minutes. Also in 1932, Admiral Yarnell took 2 aircraft carriers and 4 cruisers within bombing range of Pearl Harbor and did a simulated attack on Pearl Harbor, and basically, like we said, taught Yamamoto how you attack Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese reaction to the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't like it was during the First World War, which was excitement. And Germany wasn't excited to go to war. The Italians weren't excited to go to war, but the Japanese were. They saw themselves as a liberating force for Asia. They saw that the Japanese would drive all the Western powers out of Asia and that the Japanese would rule. You can also see there that the depiction there of President Roosevelt. Basically, they saw Americans as fat, slow, and very decadent. So as we are getting ready for war, everyone gets ready for war. World War II touches every aspect of American lives. Millions of Americans leave home to serve in the armed forces or moved to the cities to work for defense industries. Basically, we are coming out of the Great Depression. The war really takes us out of the Depression and ramps up everything. Basically, the war ended all unemployment, or a lot of it. Industries were now growing and producing materials for the war effort. People faced government rationing as well as price controls and raised taxes. Now, we were drafting men, but we didn't draft women, but women did contribute to the war effort. More than 258,000 women enlisted in the WACs, the WAVs, or the WAFs. So the Women's Army Air Corps, the Women's Appointed Voluntary Emergency Service was the Navy, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, Army Air Corps. As in World War, basically what they did is they performed crucial services during the war, medical and technical support, flying equipment to war zones, and decoding enemy messages. As in World War I, the production of war materials had to be regulated and maintained. In January of 1942, Roosevelt called for the production of 60,000 planes, 25,000 tanks, and 6 million tons of shipping in 1942 alone. This is what Yamamoto was worried about, waking up the United States' great power, which was in industry, and that would be the downfall of Japan. Many civilian industries converted to wartime production. Government agencies were created to ensure that there was well-organized production of war material. They controlled the use of raw materials and limited on non-essential production. New house building stopped. Iron and steel that was needed for the war. So did production of refrigerators and washing machines. Gasoline needed to fuel the fight was rationed, so there was rationing going on. The government offered businesses incentives to convert to wartime production. Some were paid, some were given government loans for low interest rates. So some of the things that were rationed during this time was rubber, gasoline, meat, flour, butter, sugar, and cigarettes. Basically, with the conversion to wartime production, many people had a lot of money to spend, but because there was no consumer goods to spend it on, that led to inflation. Roosevelt moved to control the runaway inflation that could ruin the economy. The National War Labor Board imposed wage controls that would be maintained, but would not improve the workers' basically standard of living. Wages would keep pace with the cost of living. Two programs that came out during rationing were the certificate and the plan and the coupon plan. If you were under the certificate plan, people who needed products like cars, tires, typewriters for their jobs could apply at the local rationing board. If they were accepted, they would give you a certificate for what you need. The coupon plan was basically used by everyone, civilian-wise, that needed food. So each family received a ration book that you could use to buy meat, sugar, and gas. The number of coupons was basically to the size of the family. Once used up, the family couldn't buy that item anymore until there were more coupons issued. So to finish up this segment, here's a question with what's going on in our world today. We are pretty much well off where we are as a country in the United States. Could you live with rationing? And the other question is, could the citizens of today live with rationing? Something to think about before our next segment.